as some of you might know, we have made a bit of a change to our diversity programming here at Alvis. That's come along with the establishment of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which I also lead and which is going through regular meetings these days. And if anybody here is interested in being a part of that, I hope you'll come and talk to me after it. I'm certainly glad to have this attendance, especially some of the faces I see from the facilities. Always glad to have you. And the goal has been that for our diversity trainings we have throughout the year, that we would get away from a model where we were just speaking about diversity generally and cultural competence generally, right? And instead we wanted to talk about particular barriers, particular issues, and answer particular questions that related to specific demographics and specific groups. So rather than just talking about cultural competence as this vague ephemeral thing, let's have a section where we talk about race, and let's have a section where we talk about sexuality or disability. Right? And so I've led a few of those trainings, but as you might imagine, I'm not going to be the best person to speak about any of these groups, right? I can do my best, I can do my research, but we're really going to get the most value when we have individuals from those communities or individuals who have a lot of experience working with those communities coming in here and helping us understand what those communities are facing and how we as an organization can work to become more inclusive and to better serve our clients and to better work with our staff that fit into those various categories or that might identify with or have experiences that are unique to people in those categories or people from those groups. And so with that in mind, we had a religious diversity training earlier this year, we had a racial diversity training this year, and today we have sexuality, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and other training. And you might wonder what an other is or what other might count as, and so we'll talk about that a little bit throughout. But of course, that'll be Lori's purview. But this is still a cultural competence training. This is still part of the original, we're all here to get our credit for having taken cultural competence training. So we're going to go through a little bit of the generic stuff that I like to have at the beginning of each of these trainings before we get into the more specific stuff. So let's talk about that now. Let's talk about what diversity is. So when I say we as an organization value diversity as a core organizational priority, what do I mean by that? What do you think diversity is? All right, you got a good talkative bunch, I'm glad.
Diversity is, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Diversity is just a breakdown of different religions, different races, ethnicities, cultures. It just encompasses everything and anything that's not exactly the same.
Good. So diversity might just, you say it's not exactly the same. Diversity is just modes of difference, ways in which we can be different from one another, right? And maybe I'm different from some folks in this room because I have blue eyes, or I'm different than some folks in this room because I'm wearing a button-down shirt rather than a blouse or some other kind of outfit, right? But we also recognize that there are particular kinds of difference between groups, right, where there might be a good reason for us to pay attention to how those differences affect the way we treat one another, the way we interact with one another, and the kinds of power relations that might exist between individuals or between groups, and the kinds of barriers that people might face because the world is built around certain groups and not around others, right? So Bob mentioned a few of those. Bob mentioned religious diversity, right? And that I always think about religious diversity when I'm thinking about, for instance, something like paid days off. And I think about something like the holiday calendar of Orthodox Jewish individuals, right? Now, if you're an observant Orthodox Jewish individual, there are 11 days which, if you're being properly observant, you shouldn't work. And because Jewish individuals have on a lunar calendar, there are going to be certain years where all 11 of those days fall on a weekday, on a work day. And so we might wonder, what would a person do if they worked at Alvis and they worked here for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, so they had, I believe it's 10 10 paid vacation days, right? And for a lot of us, those of us that aren't observant Jews, paid holidays might be opportunities to go on trips, might be opportunities to go spend time with family, right? But if your priority is to make sure you're not working for those 11 Jewish holidays, right, then having those 10 paid days off, that might not be enough for you to even get those holidays off that you need if you want to be properly observant, right? So when I think of religious diversity as a matter of how we sort of interact with one another and how our group membership might affect our status in the workplace or our status in human services, I think about that. So when we talk about religious diversity, what other kinds of diversity might matter in terms of the identities and the kinds of groups that we want to be conscious of when we're thinking about the ways that we're different from one another in an organization like Alphas?
Culture, maybe?
Culture? Well, culture, that's a big word. So what kinds of things fall under culture?
Okay, so when I meant that, I was thinking, so we have folks who are from Africa that work here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I may not be as cognizant of whatever their ways, might be. It may be different from what I was raised. So, interacting with them may be a little different. So just being mindful of that.
Okay, so culture in terms of ethnicity,
Yeah.
right? In terms of place of origin, where you were raised maybe, and how there might be certain cultural norms, cultural beliefs, or just things that come along with where you're from, right? Also, really close to that is going to be something like race, right? So racial diversity is something, in fact, race is what everyone sort of jumps to as soon as they think about diversity in the workplace. Race is sort of the first hot button one. Right? So race, culture, ethnicity, lots of categories here. What else? What other kinds of diversity, kinds of difference might we want to be conscious of as we're trying to create a good work environment and a good service environment for our clients? Race, culture, religion, ethnicity.
Well, also, in the identity, what do our clients, supported living, how do they identify themselves? To what culture or subculture?
Uh-huh.
And how do you bring that all together?
Good. Okay, so cultural identification. Good. Gender, and gender and sex, are those the same thing? No? Okay, so I might set that conversation aside because it might come up a little bit later, but sexual difference, gender difference, right? And that we know that there's a long history, for instance, of power differentials between men and women in the workplace, right? Which can take the form of people in positions of power or pay discrepancies, right? And so that's something we want to be conscious of. We know that there are certain, there are going to be certain issues which are issues for everybody, which are important to make sure everybody has a supportive workspace, but which have historically been associated with the women's movement and that have historically been higher priorities for women's advocacy groups, things like childcare, right, and things like paid maternity leave. So good, lots of different kinds of difference that we want to be aware of and observant of. Let's see what else we might put on that list. So we have sexual orientation, that of course is something we're going to talk about today. We have things like socioeconomic diversity, income, and I often want to distinguish between socioeconomic status of the individual versus socioeconomic status of the family that individual comes from. I think that's an important distinction to draw, right? Sometimes you can have an individual who might not have much money in the bank, but they come from a lot of money, and that might make a big difference to how they see the world, right? Or vice versa. Age difference. Now, one of the trainings that's going to be coming up in December is probably going to be, I have it on the calendar as ageism and ableism. I think I might just change it to ageism. So age diversity issues in the workplace. I'm working on getting a speaker from the Central Ohio Area Agency on Aging, COAAA. Working on getting a speaker from them to come and talk to us about that. Diet, so individuals that for religious observance or health reasons might avoid certain things, right? That's the kind of diversity we want to be aware of, especially if we're working in contexts where we're providing food for people, whether that at events, right, or in our facilities. Education, past experiences, marital status and family structure, people that come from different kinds of families, right? And that forever. We've always been aware of the existence of single-parent families and how those might provide different experiences growing up, or people that grew up under the care of maybe people who weren't their biological parents. We also now have different structures of families as we now live in a world where marriage is not limited to one man and one woman legally, and so we know that people are going to come from families that are different in those ways as well. And we don't yet know, or maybe I don't know, maybe I've yet to learn how that might create difference that requires awareness and respect. Social connectedness and status, military service, health, whether someone is living with an illness or a disability, right? And that's not necessarily a health matter, but lots of different dimensions of diversity. And so this becomes a pretty complicated game, right? To create an organization, to create a work environment where we're all aware of and willing and able to accommodate the differences that exist between us, right? And so that's the big idea goal of something like diversity training. So we talk about what is diversity. So diversity valuable in a place like ours, particularly because we aim to reflect the community we serve, right? If we know we serve a very diverse range of clients, individuals that come to us either on the supportive living side or on the corrections side, they're going to come from all different walks of life. They're going to look different. They're going to have different beliefs. And we want to make sure that we as an organization are prepared and equipped to serve and work with all of them, right? And that's going to be made harder if we don't reflect the community that we're serving, right? If we are monolithic in some way, whether it's racial or whether it's economic or educational or whatever, if we're monolithic in some way that hey Michaela, come on in, that our client base is diverse, that's going to compromise our ability to serve those that community well. We want to recognize that each person is unique and encourage difference in perspectives, identity, and experiences. In particular, we're strengthened when we invite and encourage a variety of points of view. Before diversity became an organizational priority for companies and organizations across the country, we might have assumed that there was a single way of looking at things, and that way of looking at things was reflected by the kinds of people that naturally, of course, were put in power, right? And now we recognize that a wide diversity of individuals in decision-making positions is going to allow this variety of folks to bring their unique experiences to bear on particular organizational problems that need to be solved, strategies that need to be developed, and we're only going to benefit from bringing that wide variety in. At the same time, when I think of diversity, when I think of a word like diversity, I often think of something that can look very simplistic. I think of something that can look like box checking and quota filling. Right? So if you want to make a group of people in a room diverse, all you got to do is make sure that you've got lots of different kinds of people in that room. Right? And then, what do you do with the people in that room? Well, that might be important, but it's not necessarily a matter of diversity. Right? So in my mind, when diversity as an organizational priority evolved into something that we call inclusion, right, that was a recognition that diversity itself wasn't enough. That having a bunch of different people in this building or in all of our buildings, people that look differently, the people that come from different backgrounds, people that had different sets of experiences, that's not going to be enough to get us where we want to go, where we actually have a sincerely diverse organization, unless we're all also working to be inclusive. Now, what does inclusive mean? Or what's inclusion? Coco does this. Yes?
I think it's going beyond tolerance of differences. I think it's more of an acceptance and being okay with whatever differences people have, whether or not you agree or disagree.
Okay. So I think, what's your name?
Kim.
Kim suggests that inclusion is a matter of not just tolerance, but acceptance of the way people are. Does anybody want to add to that? Marcus.
I think inclusion is making the right or the necessary accommodations at your agency to make sure everyone that does work there from different backgrounds and walks of life all have a comfortable work experience.
So Marcus uses an interesting word there. He uses the word accommodation. And I want to think about the relationship between inclusion and accommodation. So suppose that I have a racially diverse group of friends and or a group of coworkers, and I decide that I want to invite all my coworkers out to a happy hour. And so I send out a little email invitation, and I say, hey, everybody, all of my coworkers are welcome at that happy hour. Right? Have I been properly inclusive in that situation? Why not?
Because you didn't really ask them, like, what would be the best time, or what even would be the best day? Do you got anything going on? You wanna ask them, like, what's up with you, and this is the best time, so that you can take all that information and
Yeah.
figure out the best way and best date.
That's a great point, Coco. So now I'm going to set up maybe what's the website? It's not Doodle. It's something. You send it to something poll. Doodle poll?
Doodle.
Is it Doodle poll where you can find out, okay, like what times work for everybody? You can identify a certain time. I send this to all my coworkers. Let's say I work with like 9 coworkers, and there's a lot of. In this case, I'm thinking of racial diversity. So I send out a doodle poll, and everyone says Tuesday at 5:30 works for me. And I said, great. Let's all go to happy hour Tuesday at 5:30. Have I been inclusive?
Accommodating.
Have I? Okay, good. As pertains to the racial diversity of my coworkers, in that situation, I'm inclined to think that allowing everybody to come suffices to include them. Right? I think also about this Abercrombie and Fitch case recently, right, where a woman was fired because she wanted to wear a hijab, which was not allowed in the dress code. She sued Abercrombie and Fitch. She won. Abercrombie and Fitch lost this wrongful termination lawsuit. Now, in my mind, all Abercrombie and Fitch had to do in order to include this woman was to allow her to wear her hijab. Right? So sometimes inclusion is just a matter of allowing people in and not pushing them out for unnecessary reasons or for bad reasons. Now, what about that happy hour case? What if I have a bunch of coworkers and they're diverse in all sorts of ways, and one of them's in a wheelchair? And now I invite and I say, hey, here's our doodle poll, Tuesday at 5:30, let's all go to happy hour. And then I propose a location that doesn't have a handicap ramp. Now have I been inclusive? Right? Even though I've done the same thing, maybe. Maybe, let's say it's the same place that I invited all my friends to in the first scenario. Right? But now it's not inclusive because there's an individual that's going to be excluded by the situation itself. And so what do I have to do? Suppose that I want to be inclusive of that individual in a wheelchair. What do I have to do?
Find a location that has a wheelchair ramp.
Maybe I find a better location, right? What if we live in a world pre-ADA and no one has a wheelchair ramp?
Then you gotta find people who are willing to pick the person.
Maybe we pick that wheelchair up. And maybe before we do so, we got to check the comfort level of the individual we're talking to, right? Maybe that's a good solution, maybe it's not. Maybe we all really want to go to this bar, and so we ask that individual, like, hey, how do you feel about us picking up? Maybe that'd be too much attention. Maybe that would embarrass them. And so then you back up and find a different strategy. Or maybe they're fine with it, in which case, all right, we can all go to this bar. All right? Maybe if you really are no options out there, maybe you get out there, you build a ramp. Maybe you get out there and you advocate for better disability accommodation, right? This is getting a little extreme for a happy hour. But sometimes inclusion means going that far. Sometimes if you work in an environment or live in an environment where there's systemic or consistent exclusion of individuals in some groups, maybe you have to go out there and conduct that advocacy, right? April.
Maybe not everyone's comfortable with a happy hour environment.
Ooh, there you go. Maybe just by suggesting a happy hour, right? So I don't drink myself, and when I first started doing that, maybe I would have been less comfortable going somewhere where everybody was drinking. So maybe before you jump to proposing a happy hour, you propose some other thing. Maybe there's a tea bar or a place where everybody can get snacks. I don't know.
Or just call it something different.
Just call it something, yeah, a gathering, right? Maybe it's the exact same location, but you call it something that doesn't sort of naturally point to the alcohol consumption, and some people will be more comfortable there. Yeah, another great example. So inclusion, so we said diversity was a matter of getting everybody in the room. Inclusion is a matter of making sure they actually feel like they belong in that room. And sometimes getting them in the room is enough for that, sometimes it's not. Right? And when it's not, we take those extra measures, we find those extra strategies. How we doing? A few more minutes. All right. And finally, inclusion is going to be a matter of making sure everybody feels like they're participating in that organization's growth. Right? So maybe it's not just a matter of finding a bar that the individual in a wheelchair can go. Making sure that individual is part of the decision-making process by which you end up at whatever institution you go to. Right? And so in the case of Alvis, I think a lot of times diversity is also a matter. I think, for instance, we have a diversity committee and a social engagement committee, or an engagement committee. And the engagement committee's goal is to get individuals at all levels of the organization engaged in decision-making processes here. I think of those as very overlapping and intersecting goals. That one way of making sure everybody feels included in our organization is making sure that they're participating in the decision-making process that guides where our organization is going. And finally, I'll just go through this really quickly before we bring Lori up. So there's diversity, there's inclusion, there's cultural competence. You might notice when I'm talking about this, sometimes I use the acronym CCID. That's cultural competence, inclusion, and diversity. And I think of the history of this work as part of organizational health as moving from diversity as the guiding concept to inclusion as the guiding concept, and then finally to cultural competence as the guiding concept. And so I feel like this is the most recent stage in our social evolution towards trying to really understand how to do this work well. So what's cultural competence? Well, I think of cultural competence as being prepared to learn what you need to learn in order to successfully be inclusive. Right? So before I led that religious diversity training a few months ago, I actually didn't know how many holidays observant Jews were not permitted to work in. Right? That was the thing I learned while I was putting together PowerPoint for a training. And suppose I was in a position of power at Alvis, which I'm not. But suppose that I was in a position to make decisions like that, decisions about paid time off, decisions about holidays, right? If I didn't know about when certain people need to be working and when certain people need to be not working, then I would be from the beginning compromising my own ability to create a work environment that was inclusive of individuals from all different religious backgrounds. Right? So, and maybe it doesn't mean that the answer is to give everybody 30 paid days off, right? I don't know what the right answer is going to be, and I also don't mean that I could create a religion where I'm not allowed to work the first 6 months of the year, and then it's immediately decided that So there might be some kinds of compromises. There might be some ways that we need to create that accommodating space without also compromising efficiency or organizational effectiveness, right? Those sorts of negotiations might need to happen. But those negotiations can't get off the ground if we don't know in the first place what kinds of things need to be accommodated. And so learning more about the unique obstacles that face, for instance, women in the workplace, or unique obstacles that face individuals with disabilities or health problems, individuals that aren't straight, individuals that are gay or lesbian or bisexual or other, individuals that are not cisgender, that are transgendered, right? Learning more about what kinds of accommodations are going to create a properly inclusive environment for all these different kinds of individuals, that's going to be an essential process, part of the process of actually creating an inclusive work environment where diversity can not just exist, but can be utilized as a strengthening feature of our organization. And so for that reason, cultural competence is an ongoing process of education and openness. It's not something that you get after taking so many cultural competence trainings. It's a kind of pervasive interest that leads you to read news articles or read advocacy pieces, to get out there and to educate yourself and to educate others to the extent you can about the kinds of unique obstacles faced by members maybe of your own group, members of groups that you're a member of, or members of groups that you're not a member of. Getting out there and learning more about individuals that might face obstacles and barriers that you might not have previous familiarity with. So that's the evolution, and that's what we're trying to accomplish through this series of trainings. To move from diversity, where we create an organization where everybody gets to come under the tent, to inclusion, where not only is everybody under our tent, but everybody gets to be part of what we're doing under that tent, and we get there via something like cultural competence, right? Via an ongoing educational process where we're learning whatever we can and as much as we can about the particular needs and accommodations necessary for all individuals we want to welcome under this tent to strengthen our organization and our community. And so, that's the end of our introductory generic diversity piece. This is always the first half hour of every one of these trainings. But now, the really exciting part and the reason we're all here, I'm going to bring Lori up. She's got her own PowerPoint that I'm going to switch to. And Lori is from Stonewall, Columbus. Has anybody heard of the Pride Festival? Okay. Pretty big deal, right? It's like right before Comfest, and it just takes over the whole city, especially the downtown Short North area, right? You wouldn't think that one person would be in charge of that whole thing, would you? Right? Lori's in charge of that whole thing. And so she's here to talk to us about sexual orientation as a feature, as it relates both to professional context in our organization, our staff, and also social service and human services and correctional context as pertains to our clients. So a warm welcome, please, for Lori.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. This is really my favorite part of my job, is to get to come out, and I really do prefer this to be a conversation and a dialogue. So I want you to ask me questions. This is your chance to ask me anything you want. A question you've been curious about the LGBTQ community. We're going to explain exactly what that acronym means. And you are not going to offend me. Believe me, I've heard it all. So this is your place if you want to ask questions. I also, from the outset, really like to say I'm not here to question your religious beliefs. I'm not here to question your morality in regards to the LGBTQ community, and sometimes we see that. Often it's religious beliefs that can cause barriers to communication with this community. Again, I'm not here to question that. This is just about being a respectful and professional coworker and working better with your clients. That's what it's for. So from the outset, I'm not trying to, say anything about anyone's religious beliefs. Again, my name is Lori, and I am the Pride Festival. I'm also the program coordinator at Stonewall Columbus. We have 15 different programs, which keeps us pretty busy. A little bit of my own backstory. I was raised in Westerville, Ohio, and I actually finally figured out I was a lesbian at 13 years old. I had my first girlfriend at 13, and hold on to your shorts, that was 1975. And I tried to reach out to the community then, actually experienced physical violence at the hands of the LGBT community itself, and fled this Westerville in Columbus like my clothes were on fire when I was 18 years old. Went to New York City for 20 years, went to Southern California for 10, and came back in 2007 and discovered how this city had transformed into a very LGBTQ friendly community. I was stunned. And so I'm back here, I'm happy, and again, this is one of the most progressive cities in the country now that welcome our community. So that's sort of what I bring to this. And also, I'll talk a little bit about, I lived in New York City at Ground Zero during the AIDS crisis, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But feel free, anything you want to know, ask me. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the LGBTQ community. And you might have heard the word Stonewall besides in Stonewall, Columbus. President Obama, as a matter of fact, mentioned Stonewall in his second inaugural address. Stonewall really was a bar in New York City on Christopher Street. It was a gay bar. And let's talk about what it was like to be gay a little bit in the 50s and 60s, even in New York City. Bars like this, which were really our only gathering places until the last 15 or 20 years when we've had community centers, bars were our community centers. But what might happen if you visit one of those bars in that time is that you would be subject to a police raid. And what did a police raid mean in those days? Not only would you be carted off to jail, but the next day your name would be printed in the paper, which meant that you may lose your home, your family, your job in one fell swoop. So it was a risk, it was an act of resistance just to step foot in one of those bars. And often we found more marginalized people in those bars who sort of worked outside of the mainstream cisgender heterosexual world because many people could not risk being in there. So that's what it was like to be in the bars. So in 1969 in June, Stonewall itself had gone through many raids over the years. and it was just the tipping point one night. One night, the police decided to raid it again, and individuals inside fought back for the first time. They resisted their arrests, and again, a tipping point. The community found out about this and started gathering around Stonewall and started resisting with the police. That would evolve into weekend demonstrations and actually riot, confrontation with the police for that entire weekend. And that is known really as the beginning of the gay rights movement. Started right there at Stonewall. I always like to say, and I say this every year when I do Pride, never forget, because it's a big party now, never forget Pride started as a riot. And that's important for us to remember as we go forward and gain more equality. It's important to remember where that began. So, you know, and it's interesting how a community, and it tells its own history. And just recently, there's sort of been community historians and a lot of writing about really who were the original Stonewall activists. And you might have remembered there was a movie called Stonewall that came out about 6 months ago. Our community completely boycotted it because, once again, it was from a white gay male perspective. And the sort of whitewashing and gender washing of that story, when the truth of the matter is, the individuals that actually fought back that night, okay, were what we would call transgender women of color now. They were called drag queens then, for lack of a better word, but it was you always hear it was the drag queens, the people, the women of color, particularly trans women of color, that fought back. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, these are really the faces of Stonewall. And it's important to remember because just now we're starting to hear this and this history and people recognizing that it was trans women of color that were really the Stonewall activists. So Stonewall happens the next year, June 28, 1970. The first Gay Pride Parade was a anniversary of the Stonewall riots. So that's how the Pride Parade started. It was actually a commemoration of the Stonewall riots from the year before. So that's where every Pride Parade, every Pride Festival in the world started in 1970 in New York City as a commemoration of the riots. So that brings us to Stonewall Columbus. We have named ourselves after Stonewall, obviously. And again, we were formed in 1981. We just celebrated our 35th year this year in Pride. And really, this was a time in 1981, I don't know if you remember, but it was when Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority really came out. And it was the first really big vociferous attacks upon the gay community, especially in terms of religious intolerance. So activists in Columbus thought they needed to come together. They needed to add their voice to that conversation and that dialogue. And that's how Stonewall Union at that time was formed. And in 1997, we became Stonewall Columbus. We're in a little community center right there at 4th Avenue and High Street. I'm very proud to say we're building a new building in about 6 months. We'll actually be a little campus now. We've outgrown this tiny little community center. So that's a long way in 35 years. Oops, back here. So, our own Columbus Pride, as we talked about a little before, let's remember that the first Columbus Pride in 1981 was 200 people walking down High Street, many with bags over their heads, because walking in the Pride Parade meant that you would more than likely lose your job, especially if you were a teacher, if you were employed by the city in any way. So this year, we had 500,000 people this year to Pride over the 2-day festival and the parade. That's a phenomenal change. 35 years, we've gone from 200 people with bags over their heads to 500,000 people in every major corporation in this city, their employees participating under the banner of their company's names. It's quite an astounding change. We're going to talk a little bit about why that change is too. Again, we come back to the AIDS crisis also. I lived through that in the late 80s and early 90s. Every gay male friend I knew, and my best friend died, not one survived. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. How did we go from the AIDS crisis to marriage equality? Really, in 25 years. That's a stunning difference. And I'll say it again and again. There's one reason the AIDS crisis made us understand that we had to live out. Because if we were invisible, it was too easy to let us die if we were invisible. So the act of us, all of us, collectively deciding to come out so that everybody had a son or a daughter or a mother or an aunt who was gay, that made a difference. And over that time, when individuals, we stopped becoming the other. We started to become family and friends and co-workers. And that's an amazing difference. And I still to this day believe that's why we decided to come out. That's when being in the closet started to take on a little bit of shame in our community. Because the AIDS crisis really made us see the risk in being invisible. And that's for any community. So that's a little history right there. I'll come back to it a bit. But now we want to talk about language, and with any minority community or any community at all, how important language is. And I feel like people often may be aloof or don't want to talk to someone or talk about something when you don't know the right language because you're so afraid of offending. I always say often, I don't think people are bigots. I think people are intimidated by the language and therefore tend to stay away because they're afraid of offending someone, not because they're a bigot. We hear it all the time, and I just gave this is a tiny analogy to that. I just gave I was really an amazing moment. I was asked this year to do a presentation to the National Guard out at the Armory. Again, this is how far we've come. And I told them, you know, we have a veterans program now, very robust veterans program, and I'm starting to deal with colonels and sergeants, and I'm so intimidated because I don't understand the ranks. So I try to avoid like addressing someone because I'm so afraid I'm going to call a colonel a sergeant or a general. So I said it's the same thing. I tend to pull back a bit because I'm afraid of offending, not because I have any bigotry against veterans. It's because I'm afraid of offending. So I think, again, that's why these are important, because you become more, not only does our community become more comfortable as your coworker and your clients, but you become more comfortable in truly engaging with members of our community. And if you're unsure, especially today, ask. So let's talk about this album. I could talk about this right here for 2 hours. Just this LGBTQ and how this has changed and how it's changing right now. So I think most people, we'll go through them all here. Most people knows what a lesbian is. I love it to say, everybody knows Ellen. Ellen made it really easy. It is women who are romantically and sexually attracted to other women. Very simple. Gay used to be the umbrella term for all of our community. Again, a sort of white male, cisgender male umbrella name to our entire community, made the rest of us somewhat invisible, so of course that's changed. The gay in particular now referring to men who are romantically and sexually attracted to women, to men, or bisexual, an individual attracted to both genders, and we're going to expand on that in a moment. And of course transgender, we're going to expand on that in a moment too, so I want to hang off on that. And it's the big Q. I want to talk to you about the big Q here and how important language is. You know that Stonewall Columbus's board voted last year to add the Q? A board had to vote on adding another letter. That's how important language can be, even to our own community. And just to let you know, I do cultural competency with our own staff every 6 months because the language changes. It's a dynamic community, and this is why. Q, here's the deal. Our youth now, this is the word queer is being certainly empowered by our youth, our college students, and here's why. They don't feel that the LGBT is inclusive enough, and they don't like the idea of division. You know, up until the AIDS crisis, our community was very divided. For example, in New York City, I went to a women's bar. A man couldn't get in that bar without being escorted by a woman. okay? A friend of mine disappeared. I decided to try to go find him in the male bars in New York City in the 80s. I wasn't allowed in those bars. So, you know, this goes to exemplify a separation in our community. Kids aren't having it now. They aren't having it. And here's another big reason. And I'm going to throw this out here real quick. We have our transgender outreach coordinator, who I hope visits you again, named Liam Gallagher. Liam transitioned, okay, from female to male. Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Transitioned from female to male, okay, and is fully transitioned now, legally, everything. Well, Liam before Liam transitioned, Liam was a lesbian and had a girlfriend, okay? Great. So now Liam transitions, is legally male, in every way before the law, still has the same girlfriend, so what does that make them? A heterosexual couple. That is not a heterosexual couple, that is a queer couple. If you can see the subtle difference. So our youth is saying, I mean, it's queer, they self-identify as queer. They don't identify as a heterosexual community. The language wasn't big enough to include gender differences, and that's where we're going to get. We were fine as long as everything was sexual identification. But once we put in issues of gender and transitioning genders, this wasn't big enough anymore. Not a big enough umbrella. That's why our youth have brought the word queer, because not everybody is in those specific categories. Okay, so what happens? Love the word queer. I love it. What do you think our community over 50 feels about the word queer?
It's derogatory.
Right. It was what they were used when they were beaten up, when they were thrown out of their homes, when they lost their jobs. So I consistently go to our youth and say, hang on, you got to understand what queer means to our senior community. And I got to say to our senior community, listen, these kids are taking back that word. Like a lot of minorities, you take the word that was derogatorily used against you and you turn it back into your own self-identity and you take that power back. That's what our youth are doing. But there you go. Language even in our own community that's controversial and that causes often problems. But you know, once I explain it to the kids and once I explain it to the seniors, you know, and get them talking to each other. When you talk about age and diversity, big one in this community, big one. Our experiences as senior LGBTQ community and kids now, and the changes in 25 years, it's difficult to even have a conversation. So language, instead of using it to keep us apart, we use the word queer to engender discussion and dialogue in our own communities to share history and share experiences. But you all using that, okay, let's talk about using that word. It's very easy. Let's remember that these are labels, and they are labels. These are labels of self-identification. Important word here. Self-identification. These labels are so we can self-identify to find each other, okay? But, you know, you don't get to decide if somebody's a lesbian, okay? They are. I've self-identified as a lesbian. I live my life as a lesbian. My self-identification comes first, okay? So generally, even myself now, and you know, we use the word queer in Stonewall. We have, I'll talk about it later, queer ghost hunting now, okay? So we use the word queer. But it's still one of those words you need to be careful with. It's really about someone self-identifying as queer. I just want you to understand when you hear them self-identify as queer, you know what that means. You know where they're coming from, okay? And how, you know, how to be careful with particularly seniors. And I'm not even seniors, people over 40. Really, that word, even me. I mean, I use a word all the time because I like inclusiveness, but, you know, there's something still in me that you know, it's just that when someone uses that word, it's always going to sort of trigger things for me. So, all right. So what is sexual orientation? It is very clearly, I think most of us can understand this now. It is physical and or emotional attraction to others. can be attracted to one or more gender. It's who you fall in love with. It's who you want to have sex with. It's really just as simple as that. And here's the thing I think you need to think about too. It can be fluid. Okay, it's not necessary. A lot of us, hey, I've been a lesbian since I was 13. I knew I never had an issue with it. I have 70-year-olds coming out now. So it's fluid. And you know, it's very often who you fall in love with. Have I ever been in love with a man? No. Do I rule that out for the rest of my life? No. He'd have to be pretty spectacular, but but I'm just saying it can be fluid, and it can be, you know, you can truly fall in love with anybody. So it's much more sort of a fluid thing. Again, it's a process, and again, self-defined. I am a lesbian. You don't decide where I'm a lesbian. I'm a lesbian. Decide of itself. So here's the big elephant always in the room. Okay, now you're gonna have to think about this because you've never thought about this way before. I guarantee you. Okay. So what is sex? Sex is really when you pop out, doctor holds you up and goes, it's a boy, it's a girl. That's sex. We call that assigned sex at birth. ASAB, assigned sex at birth. It's really just your physical anatomy, your chromosomes, whatever that is. It's just physically what you're born. It's what's on your birth certificate. Okay? That's what sex is. Okay? Gender. We are so used to thinking of sex and gender as the same. Sex, there's legal battles right now in bills as to whether or not sex and gender means the same thing. It isn't, especially to our community. Gender is the expectations that are socially constructed to determine what is male and female. Okay? How we dress, how we're supposed to act, what jobs we're supposed to have. Okay? You know, that is really culturally created. You think about it, many other cultures in the world have different cultural restrictions about what males and females should do. It is constructed. You do not come out of the womb knowing that men should wear ties and women shouldn't. You don't come out. Gender is what you don't come out knowing. That's the difference. And so many of us who are cisgender meaning gender conforming, you more or less conform to the the notions of the gender of the sex that you were born with. So no one has to question this very often. You know, why question when it all matches? You don't have to question. So starting to think of sex and gender as two different things. Perfect example is me, okay? I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house, nothing. But there's one thing in my will. Do not let my mother bury me in a dress. Okay? I have not been in a dress since I was 10 years old. I feel like a drag queen in a dress. I'm much more comfortable about this. I'm not transgender. I don't want to be a man, nothing like that. But I am somewhat gender non-conforming. There is a spectrum of how we all feel comfortable. And I'll tell you something, talking about inclusiveness, I would not work in a place that demanded me to wear a dress every day. I would not take that job. I've never taken that job. So those sort of things about gender conformity can very much be affected by barriers that companies put forward. So that's what it is. It is your internal notion of who you are. Okay? I like to say, if you take your brain out and you put it in a jar, and you put the body in another room, that head's still going to know who they are. That head's still going to have a gender. Okay? It's not just about your anatomy at all. Think about this. Think about waking up tomorrow morning and being the opposite gender that you are right now. You're going to have the same brain. You're going to have the same notion of genders in your head, but you'll wake up tomorrow and you pull those sheets off you and you just change genders. Okay? For most of us, that's incomprehensible. For our trans community, that's what it feels like when you have gender dysphoria, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria that medically, and we'll talk about that, but that is the medical diagnosis. It is a disconnect between gender, which is in your head, it's not in your privates, gender in your head and the body assigned at birth. And the disconnect can be so strong that it can result in suicide. Very often we see so many of our trans youth that are committing suicide. It is that actually, especially when puberty starts, it is that repulsion to that body that you don't recognize. You don't recognize this body when gender's up here. And I like to talk about all this. So gender up here is your gender identity. Your heart is who you're sexually attracted to and you fall in love with. And your anatomy is what you were born with. Those are actually three separate things. Yeah.
Just a quick question. So I recently seen a video about a rapper who likes to wear like skirts
Yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah.
Now he says he's straight, he's not
Right.
gay.
That's right.
And he called himself metrosexual.
Yeah.
Can you expand on what exactly that is?
Yeah, there's new words all the time. Again, he's particularly a gender non-conforming individual. Okay, has nothing to do with his sexual orientation. That's exactly right. Remember that again. He's a gender non-conforming individual. Does not have anything to do with his sexual orientation. That's what I'm talking about is, I'll get to this next one. Sexual orientation is a perfect question. It's like I planted him right here. Sexual orientation is not the same as gender identity. Gender identity, who you fall in love with, what you're born with. Okay, not the same thing. And a perfect example there. He is gender non-conforming, okay, and identifies Pernansky, I guess. He's gender non-conforming. He's more comfortable wearing that. But that doesn't affect his sexual orientation, so he's still straight. So if you see a man who identifies as a man in what we would consider more female clothing, has nothing to do with assuming his sexual orientation at all. And we're seeing our youth in particular. You see Will Smith's son, I don't know if you've heard him, Jaden, I think his name's Jaden, very comfortable with this non-conforming. That's the new generation. They aren't being confined by what we call the binary. Now, the way that Jaden Smith dresses gives you no indication to his sexual orientation. Okay, and that's, like I said, it takes a little while because you've never had to consider those two things being different. Okay, so sexual orientation is not gender identity. If you walk away from one thing today, that's what I want you to remember, because it takes away our presumptions about people. Okay, you're not going to know someone's sexual identification until they tell you or they introduce you to their partner. You should not make assumptions otherwise until they self-identify to you what their sexual orientation is. You had a question?
Yeah, I haven't heard that if he was gay.
Right.
It was Magic, like if I look at Magic Johnson's son.
Yes.
Who is a fashion designer.
That's right.
And the way the clothing is
That's
on him. But yet you would, he might not be, like you said.
Exactly.
He's comfortable with what he's wearing.
That's right.
Comfortable to introduce his fashion to the
That's right.
world
That's
today.
right.
And I was looking at him, and he was on a talk show,
Right.
and about his fashion,
Right.
and what he's coming out with now. But yet you can't tell because he haven't opened his mouth.
Bingo, and that's the difference. You can't see sexual identification. That's another thing. You're dead on.
Yeah.
I kind of what I've got, sort of a gender non-conforming look. I'm a little bit masculine, not quite this and that. You should never make a presumption about who I'm sleeping with by the way I look, the way I act, the way I dress, because you're going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong. Yeah.
I mean, I also think it seems to bear mentioning that you can't always see gender nonconformity.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Because, for example, okay, so sexual orientation, not saying to sexual orientation is lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, etc. That's sexual orientation. Okay? Gender identity is male, female, transgender, gender fluid. I just want you to start to see the separation, and we are so used to to lumping those together, okay?
Because, I have heard one of my friends' son threw a party,
Mm-hmm,
and he called this party a crystal tea party.
okay.
And you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
But it was a party of all cultures, all, I'm saying they was all black, white, genders, male, female. But like you said, but they was all in the same gathering.
That's right.
To see this, and you would never know.
You would never know.
Because they didn't dress up like
That's
they chose to be,
Right.
the decisions that came in their life.
Right.
But they're just businessmen, business people.
And they're having so much fun with it. I
Not
mean,
even
that's what's so
going here.
inspiring about this generation. is
Yes.
They're like, we're not going to be confined by, again, this binary
That's
notion
right.
of gender. And like you were saying, gender fluid. Will Smith is what we call gender, Jaden Smith is gender fluid. He might wear a suit today and wear a skirt tomorrow.
Right.
He's gender fluid. And it is their right to do so. Why should that bother us? And again, there is just what Raleigh's saying, there's a spectrum, just like me. I like pants and a jacket. Doesn't mean I'm gonna wear a three-piece suit with a vest and appear our notions of hypermasculine. Everybody's on a spectrum. If you look around you right now as to masculinity and femininity, and us trying to put that to the binary has driven people out of their minds. You had your hand up there.
Can you talk about where pansexualism
Yeah.
falls in which category? 'Cause I
Yeah, and that's really LGBTQ 102, but I'm going to throw it out for you now. It is, again, a useful term in regards to queerness. In other words, bisexual means, in our older language, that you're attracted to either gender. Pansexual means you're attracted to all genders. So the word pansexual is a modern day word of bisexual, but it means you are open to the whole not just sexual orientation anymore. You pansexual. You are open to all notions of gender and sexuality. So it's basically you're open to everybody on the spectrum, and that's what pansexual is. So it's a modern day updating of the word bisexual, but it's being inclusive of gender now. So that's a new word, pansexual, that particularly our young people are using.
Yeah.
Again, I had a gender non-conforming job. So it again, as you were talking about diversity and all those levels of diversity, we can be gender non-conforming. For example, even I know lesbians who are gender non-conforming that are Orthodox Jews, and they're pushing the barriers of, in Orthodox Judaism in particular, there's often separation of the genders. Well, that's very difficult for someone who's gender nonconforming, particularly gender nonconforming individuals who lean towards a female self-identification. So that gender nonconformity is way beyond just clothes.
Right.
It's all of those things that affect one's life.
But then there's even more radical cases that sort of don't point to any of these particular gender
That's right.
characteristics. I have friends that if you ask, do they identify as male and female, they will say neither,
That's right.
They identify as non-gender. They prefer
Yeah.
the they pronouns, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there can be much more.
And I'm just going to get into that because you're
Okay.
doing the transgender one.
That's right, yeah.
And again, I'm stopping a little short of
Sure,
going deeply into the trans, because you're going to have a special transgender.
That's right, yeah.
But yes, we do. Again, individuals not accepting the binary, where they don't even identify gender fluid. They'll say they're gender fluid.
Yeah.
They're not male or female, they're gender fluid. And again, it's that they're truly embracing that spectrum. And when you get to the seminar in, I think, October, again, just holding back some stuff because you need your own session for transgender experiences. But just to pop in really quickly, so we can talk about this. When an individual self-identifies as being transgender, okay, they'll often do what we call transition. Okay, and that is going from the assigned sex at birth to the gender they wish. This is often done a lot of different ways. It can just be changing clothes and hair and name and pronouns necessarily, or it can include hormones, female to male. That's what we would call call that transition, is taking testosterone, and male to female taking estrogen. That can have a big effect on the physical body. And then, of course, we have notions of transitioning with surgery. Top surgery for female to male transition, full mastectomies and hysterectomies, female to male, much more difficult and very costly. But what we want to be clear about, you don't have to go through all that to be transgender, okay? You really don't. It's about self-identification. And we even have some of the transgender community who say, well, you're not really trans unless you had surgery. Again, it's the whole spectrum of gender, and really just respecting a trans individual. And that's why I wanted to talk about transition for just a second, because you may know people that go through transition. That's not uncommon. Our Grand Marshal this year, I'm so proud to tell the story. Our Grand Marshal this year for our 35th Pride was Lana Moore. Now this is incredible. Lana Moore is retired this year, was a fire captain in the Columbus Police Department. She transitioned from male to female in 2008 on the job. Okay, what does that say about a progressive city, a progressive fire department that allowed her to transition and then work as fully female as a fire captain for the last 8 years of her career? Okay, that's pretty incredible. So, you know, there was some education going on quickly when she transitioned on the job, and how to be respectful about that if someone is transitioning or if a client is transitioning. Someone just had their hand up, I think. Did you, huh?
Yeah, I had a question. If transgender and is transsexual even a?
I'll get to that. Yes, yes, I will. And we'll get to those as terms. Transgender is the updated word for transsexual. That's the old word we used to use. Again, not horrible to use transsexual. It's just outdated. That's all. You're dead on. So anyway, Karen Hanley, how can you be a respectful ally? Co-worker or your clients, okay? First of all, use their correct names and pronouns. For example, you know, they may come to you after transition, or they may be transitioning when during, let's say it's a co-worker. You know, this individual and will go from the name of Maria to Mike, okay? And that will be that will be known, and start going by the pronouns he, okay? They may not look to you fully male. They may not look to you like your expectations of gender appearance, okay? But if they state that, even if it doesn't match what your standards of men and women like, you need to use their correct names and pronouns. And I'm going to tell you a perfect example recently. I was at one of these, I won't say who, when, or where, but we started talking about Caitlyn Jenner, okay? And an individual stood up and said, you know what? I do not refer to Caitlyn Jenner. That is Bruce. Bruce is his real name. On and on like that. And I said, okay, let's take this example, all right? Let's say that your name is Elizabeth, okay? Born with the name Elizabeth. But you know, you call yourself Betty, and everybody calls you Betty. What would you think of a coworker that walks up to you and says, I'm not calling you Betty, that's stupid, your real name's Elizabeth? Well, here's a newsflash, you don't get to decide what to call other people.
Right.
It's important to remember, and that's what we're talking about. Use their correct names and pronouns that are given to you. And you'd be surprised how much this doesn't happen. And that very much in sort of, and I'm not saying here, the social service organizations, doctor's office, things like that, they will be purposely misgendered. So when I say misgendered, let's say they go by the name Maria and the pronoun her, they will be purposely misgendered as a derogatory act. Okay, we hear it all the time. We have people sitting in a doctor's office and they can hear the nurses behind the screen calling them it, her, all of that kind of stuff. So it is so important that you recognize the correct names and the pronouns of the individuals, and that is not up for discussion whether or not Mike looks like a man to you or not. If Mike wants to be called Mike, Mike wants to be called him, it's none of your business what his transition is or where he is on his transition. This is what he's decided. And whether or not he decides to do that legally, of course, with work, in HR, there's always issues. You have to use the legal names, things like that. But to respect, if someone tells you, it's not up to you whether to recognize, and I think most people understand that, that you use the name in pronouns. But there's a lot of misgendering going on as a reaction against the trans community. Yeah.
Can you give some practical advice for what to do when you feel like you don't know what pronouns someone would prefer, and really even whether they would have an opinion about that? Like,
Right.
I can imagine if I were to come to you and
Right.
say, what are your preferred pronouns?
Right.
That might really bother you that I even saw fit to ask.
Well, I generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, ask. 10 times out of 10, okay? And the way to do that, it's very simple. If you don't know and you don't want to offend, you can do 2 things. I usually go, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. What are your pronouns? You give yours first. She, her, and hers, him, his, and his. It's saying first. Generally speaking, anyone that is in transition, more than likely, I would not be offended at all if you said that to me. Here's the other thing. You can use their names. Bob's book. Bob went to the bathroom. Bob went here. I think I would advise you that if you don't, I do at Stonewall all the time. Somebody walks into the lobby, introduces themselves, okay? I like to get to know them just a little bit before I pop that question. So I'll use their name instead until I'm sure. That way I know I'm not accidentally misgendering them in any way. And that will be made obvious to you very quickly. They will tell you, most trans people will tell you their pronouns, if they're actually trans or you're your friends referring to them. It's not as big a mystery as you think. So I would say ask. No, trans people will tell you all the time, I'd rather someone ask than misgender me. Okay, purposeful. Because accidental misgendering is going to happen. I'll tell you why. I've known people in transition, and I'll tell you, you call someone she for 27 years, and then the next day it's he. Friends transition too, families transition too. But any trans person will tell you, it's not accidental misgendering. That takes time. It is like I told you with the Caitlyn Jenner, it is the purposeful misgendering to hurt and demean. And it is one of the easiest ways to be transphobic, is to not misgender. But I'm a big one for the names. I use names till I know. And I had someone actually I was with for 2 years, was sort of on the periphery of Stonewall. I never really had the chance to talk to them personally. I would have asked their pronouns, and I didn't know. So I said Tommy all the time. Was careful not to misgender. But here's the other thing you have to realize, and you'll get more into this in the transgender. Your eyes are so used to evaluating gender right away. And sometimes your eyes go to your head before your mouth does. Okay? You're just so in tune to saying she and he, and for your mind to make an immediate judgment based on these crazy gender assumptions. That's already in our mind. We've already got those barriers. So pause. But again, if you misgender someone, and they'll talk a lot about this in the trans, when you misgender someone, apologize and move on. Don't do this. Oh my God, it is so freaking hard to get this right with you. I'm trying so hard to get your gender right. Don't make a big deal out of it. Okay, if you misgender, it's like stepping on someone's toe. Say I'm sorry and go on. Okay. And you'll get into a lot more etiquette with trans, but that's sort of the idea, just as a general rule in practice that I use every day when I'm not sure of gender pronouns. And here's my favorite new thing. Let's say you go to Target and your cashier, you don't know what gender your cashier is, okay? Let's say, so what should you do if you're out in, the 3 things you should do if you're out in public and you don't know the gender of someone you're coming in contact. Here's the 3 things you should do. Forget about it, forget about it, forget about it. You don't need to know, okay? So let's talk about in general the LGBTQ community. Again, so correct name and pronouns, don't out them. Okay, this goes for the gay community, the LGBTQ community, queer community, trans community. Okay, we all come out generally, whether it's trans or whether it's a lesbian. Many of us come out in different phases. So, for example, myself, I came out a long time before I told my parents. I came out to friends. I came out to even people at work knew before my parents knew. Many others, parents know, and I'll give you the perfect example. Liam, who's our trans community outreach coordinator, worked at Jenny's, okay? No one at Jenny's knew he was trans. Many trans individuals will then just assume their lives as being, so it was female to male, okay? So Liam was male at work. Just wasn't anybody's business, didn't need to tell anybody he was transgender, okay? When the Caitlyn Jenner thing came out, Ann Fisher show, NPR, OSU radio, called Carla and Liam and wanted Liam to come on to talk about it. Liam had to make the decision that if he did that, he would be outed at work as a trans individual. So as you can see, Liam's, get this, the trans community coordinator, Stonewall, he's still not out at work. So that idea, don't presume that you know, people do it for different reasons, and often it's not safe, especially for a trans community, in more rural communities often. It's life-threatening to out somebody as trans now. There's been 32 murders of trans women of color this year alone in this nation. We have many people calling us, and the first thing we tell them, they call us from a more rural, listen, we love that you want to come out, and I'm talking about being, gay, queer, trans. First thing you have to do is make sure you're safe. Don't do it till you're safe. We tell it to youth all the time. Don't do it until you're safe. And many people aren't even safe in their own homes. Many youth come out as gay and get kicked out because of religious reasons whatsoever. They're estimating now that basically the homeless youth all over the country, 60 to 70% of the homeless youth in this country are LGBTQ. Gives you an idea. So be safe first. So it's important for you to not out them to anyone else. Often it's an issue of safety, physical or emotional, and again, may only be out to certain people. So let's talk about some language. That was great, the transsexual question. Again, just words to not use. Okay, homosexual. It's not a derogatory word in any way, but you know what it reminds us of? Shock treatments, being committed to asylums. This was very much happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, okay? It was a medicalized term. So it's not wrong. I mean, if someone would call me a homosexual or refer to me, hey, I'd like to introduce Lori Gum, she's the homosexual from Stonewall, Columbus, I wouldn't be offended by that. I'd just be...
I didn't say that, did I?
No. But you feel that cringe value. It's got that medicalized. So it's not wrong. It's just kind of outdated. She, male, he, she, obviously. Tranny, don't do it. There was such a celebrity sort of tranny, and it was all cisgender straight people calling transgender people tranny like it was cool, and it would just don't. If you're not in that community, you don't get to decide nicknames for that community. You know what I mean? So I don't even know where that came from, really. Well, we even have to put this because we're so offended by the word, we won't even put the whole thing. Okay, transvestite or transsexual. Again, we talked about transsexual, the old word for transgender. If you remember Christina Jorgensen, there was a tennis player that actually transitioned in the 70s. They were called transsexuals then. That's exactly what it was. Transgender is just a new word. Again, transsexual's not offensive. It just shows you're really out of touch with this community. That's what it shows, sort of being out of touch. Biggie, and I just watched Bill Maher this weekend, and he used this again and again. Bill Maher on HBO. It's not transgendered. I'm not gayed. You're not straighted. Okay? It's transgender, and I know anybody that uses that term has never met or interacted with a transgender person or had any culture. And Bill Maher, and he was talking about the trans community, yay, blah, blah, blah. Everybody was transgendered. And again, it's one of those language nuances, not necessarily offensive, just shows you're talking about something and you know nothing about it. That's exactly what it is. And queer, as we talked about. And don't refer to someone's sexual orientation as their lifestyle preference. My lifestyle preference is I just picked out the new color for my living room to paint next week. It's a beautiful color called Waterfall. My sexual orientation or my gender identity is not a preference, and it's offensive for it to be referred to as that. It's not that trivial. So let's talk about some quick legal issues that I bet you don't know. Here's where we are. This is when we're in a very weird place in this country. We just got marriage equality. And I'll tell you something, if you would have told 13-year-old little Lori Lesbian in 1975 that by the time in her lifetime there would be marriage equality, I would have told you never, okay? But here's a weird thing. We don't have any anti-discrimination protection. So here's the truth of the matter. Columbus has an sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity protection in Columbus proper, okay? So you can't be fired because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, all right? So here's the deal. On Sunday, I marry my wife, okay? And we go home to our little rented apartment in Westerville, and we put a just married sign on the door. We can lose our apartment. It's perfectly legal. There is no recourse. And then I go to my job the next day in Dublin, and I put my picture of me and my wife, and I can be fired from my job, and there is nothing. It's legal. So here we're in this weird place of having marriage equality, but really very few, particularly gender expression and gender identity. So state protections for LGBTQ people? None. None. As a state law, okay? State employees are protected, but only sexual orientation, not gender identity. So that means any state employee can be fired for being transgender. All right, county protections, anti-discrimination ordinance for city and county employees only. Okay? And Columbus. Columbus is quite amazing. It has a very vigorous anti-discrimination ordinance that protects LGBTQ individuals for sexual orientation and gender identity. That's been challenged 4 times in Columbus, and the plaintiff has won every time. They've all been trans cases. Very robust protections, but it's in Columbus proper. And again, it's only within city limits, so if you go out to any of the suburbs or live anywhere else, you're wide open, okay? Most people don't know that, okay? It's kind of a scary place to be. So let's talk about a couple kind of cool things. Again, Obergefell v. Hodges, Supreme Court last year. We're very proud to say that Jim Obergefell, the plaintiff in that case, was our Grand Marshal for Pride last year. We know Jim very well. And that is let's remember, marriage equality was a plaintiff from Ohio. So we have quite a presence in that Supreme Court decision, which we always take as a part of, we're very proud of. Again, anti-discrimination legislation. 32 states it's legal to fire someone for being trans. 32 states. Only 18 states prohibit workplace discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. Although now there is an EEOC ruling that just happened that actually says sexual orientation and gender identity is protected under the 1965 Civil Rights Act. That will go to the Supreme Court soon, I guarantee you. I call it the Glenda Law. It was like, oh, you've had it all along. You've had it all along. So I guarantee you that because there's an equality bill in Congress that this would be a federal protections for everybody, that's never going to pass in this non-working Congress. So probably sooner or later that's going to be before the same Supreme Court. And of course, all the anti-trans bathroom bills. We believe very much, we knew there would be a backlash against marriage equality, a backlash against our more marginalized community members, and that's exactly what happened. That's for a discussion in the trans program. Again, repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This is phenomenal. We have an extremely robust veterans program at Stonewall Columbus. I personally do veterans discharge reviews, which mean we take veterans who were dishonorably discharged from the Army, we get their records, and we appeal for their honorable discharges. I have been doing this 2.5 years. We got one, Private Donald Hallman. Thankfully, in January, we got his, and he passed away last month. We now have 14 discharge reviews in. So anyway, repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it meant that by 2010, veterans could serve, soldiers could serve openly in the United States military. And staggeringly enough, you want to talk about progress moving quickly, July 2001, transgender individuals can openly serve in the military now. Just happened, literally. So, let's talk about, for a second, cultivating safe spaces, particularly, yeah.
Is there a website that has the list of states that are progressive, so to speak, as far as?
Yes,
the
you,
law?
hrc.org. HRC has a list. ACLU also has a list of laws and protections. Both of those sites are very good about overall laws, because, you know, so much is being challenged every day. So let's talk about cultivating a safe space for LGBTQ individuals in the workplace and as your client. So basically, intervene when you hear intolerance or discrimination. Intervene when you hear your coworker calling someone a tranny or a he, she, or misgendering properly, or calling him a faggot or something like that. You know, it is your silent, just remember this, as you know, with any derogatory name for anybody, minority or otherwise, your silence condones. Your silence condones, especially when they're not around. When that individual is not around, your silence condones. Be open and listen, learn about others. You're doing that, thank you. Become familiar with the LGBT policies, laws in your community and workplace. Your HR needs to understand trans health issues, healthcare issues, legal policies, discrimination. That's really company policies that need to be decided so that when situations arise, you know, your administrators don't have to decide that on their own. So diverse workplace and hiring policies. I love when Raleigh was talking about inclusion and diversity. That's great, and it also means hiring more individuals, putting individuals in positions of responsibility to help drive the formal policies and be input into the formal policies of your company. So, because you all deal with formerly incarcerated so much, I just wanted to familiarize, and maybe you are more familiar. Are you pretty familiar with PREA?
Yeah.
Okay. We have a program at Stonewall Columbus called Inside Out. We've done it for almost 2.5 years now. We go into prisons and help facilitate LGBTQ support groups, okay? We do one at Marion. We've been doing one at Marion for 1.5 years. And we are just moved into Dayton Correctional, and we just started talking to Madison to start theirs. And again, you know, because PREA very much, you know, again, the prison rate and why that the LGBTQ community is so much more a target. And one of the things, particularly in the PREA, you know, rules which it helped alleviate, is that often LGBTQ individuals are isolated, okay? They may have been disowned by their family and friends. They may not have other LGBTQ community members in incarceration facilities. Those that are isolated are open to amazing abuse and potential harassment and harm. And also, very frankly, the corrections administration and correction officers themselves. It's no secret about the abuse, but it also gave us sort of an in to try to start making sure that you know, this abuse wasn't happening. But it's very complicated. We even have to do a safety assessment before we go into a correctional facility to make sure that it's safe for individuals to come out and identify as LGBTQ to even come to the support groups. So we're really finding the program's getting larger and larger. We used to have a reentry program, a support group that went along with this, and we may again, but it was too difficult. Inconsistency of attendance, getting people there, expecting too much, expecting us to get jobs and all the things you all do. But anyway, we are certainly working in the prisons. We're also, one of the cool thing, again, you know, PREA in particular, requiring staff working with transgender, gender non-conforming inmates to work in more conciliatory conditions, just, you know, banning surge. The trans community, and now, you know, what I wanted to flip to, this is big, okay? This is big. PREA allowed third-party reporting, okay? So it's also common for victims of abuse to face retaliation. In recognition of these barriers, PREA standards make reporting safer and easier for victims of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. So a third party is someone who reports sexual abuse and sexual harassment but is neither the victim or abuser. Stonewall Columbus is a third-party PREA reporting organization, okay? I get them all the time mothers calling, brothers calling for inmates inside that are either afraid of another inmate, a corrections officer. And again, the idea of PREA was it brought that complaint above the local jurisdiction so no retaliatory acts could happen against the individual. Now, here's what's kind of happening cool, okay, is that we're starting to have relationships with these correctional institutions. So I get a PREA report. Generally, I call their PREA compliance person, and we can talk about it first. It's amazing what happens when people know you're watching. Now, but if I didn't have the power of third-party PREA reporting, I guarantee you, none of those institutions would pay a lick of time to me. So the PREA has really empowered that. You know, there are a lot of different institutions and a lot of different phases of that. But there is a recourse now for assistance. So anyway, that's Inside Out. Again, we help that. We actually get, most of the people we've gotten to Stonewall have been from Alice. Really just coming over and find community. So we love the call. If it's an LGBTQ formerly incarcerated, we will try to integrate them into our larger programs and find volunteer opportunities, things like that. So we came out of the box really wanting to be like an official reentry group to engage in the LGBT community, but we just don't have the resources. We just bit off more than we can chew. But we'd love to have people refer to us so we can start getting into our films and our hiking groups and our support groups and our coming out groups. And we have 2 full-time counselors at Stonewall that are free. Okay, so if your clients need really counseling that is absolutely culturally competent, we specialize on trans individuals, everything. We have 2 full-time, and it's free if you have no insurance or you're on Medicaid. Adam H funds it for us. So use that as a resource. Use us for a resource. We have trans support groups. We have a trans therapy group. We have a trans social group. So again, if you have trans clients coming, get them to Stonewall. Let's work something out. We can find a way to get them there and get them back. We think, again, it's a way to engage in the community and not be isolated in the larger everything.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do your agency help with housing with these individuals?
No, that's the problem. And there was expectations of that. We can't. We're a little community center. We do all of this. We sometimes hear that apartments are open from the LGBTQ community, so, but it's not a full-time resource. We are in no way a job, housing, anything. We're just a community center. And again, we stopped the reentry because we thought we were falsely creating too many expectations of that. We rely on you all for, I send them to you for that, basically. So here's some of our services, just so you know. Grief support, veterans, trans group, counselors. We have a new LGBT refugee program. We have 17 refugees from Uganda and Somalia that we're working with. Photography club, senior club, running club, hiking. We have queer ghost hunting now. We do the legal literacy. We have a full-blown, as Raleigh knows, film festival in the fall from November 13th to 19th. We do a lot of things. We do a lot of things that your clients can be engaged in to become part and make friends and get chosen family from this community. So you should be on our email list that gives sort of our weekly events that any of this might be appropriate to your clients. So this is me. L-Dom at stonewallcolumbus.org. I am the most accessible person in the world. You have questions, call me. You need a resource, call me, because even if I don't have the resource, I'll find it for you, no matter what you need. We have a lot of resources that we can help you with. And also very often someone will call me next week, and it won't be about a client or a coworker. Someone will call me and say, you know what, we think my nephew's trans. Okay. Call us. You know, we have a trans outreach coordinator if there's just someone you need to talk to. Our counselors can also, we do family counseling for LGBTQ families. Some trans individual youths have adult families and adult trans have kids. So, you know, we're really about, if you have questions or need someone to help, send them to me and we will make sure that they get taken care of. Again, the VA now has an LGBTQ liaison. They are wonderful. Her name's Jessica Homan. As a matter of fact, 2 months ago, there was a rule that has been implemented that says every VA in the country now has to have an LGBTQ liaison. So times have changed at the VA. I work very closely with them. So if you've got veterans, things like that, especially if they're LGBTQ, myself and Jessica Holman, we work very closely together. This is another exciting thing. ARC, AIDS Resource Center, has now officially turned into Equitas. It is a federally funded LGBTQ health center in the Short North. They have caseworkers. They will treat AIDS, psychiatric counseling for trans, endocrinologists, counseling. It is a full-service LGBTQ health center, okay? And so they are an amazing new resource for us. Equality Ohio, any laws, law issues, legal issues, you want a lawsuit, call Equality Ohio. And Bravo, of course, is our anti-violence organization that can help, especially do anti-violence seminars or mediate violence situation. If anyone experiences violence or a hate crime because they're LGBTQ, Bravo should be called right away after the police.
I'm going to actually take the first question just because when I was inviting you and we were talking about this a lot, I talked to you a lot about corrections, because Inside Out
Yes.
has a lot of really interesting overlap with the kind of services that we either provide or seek to connect our clients with.
Exactly.
One thing I might not have talked to you enough about in those conversations is that a full half of our organization is dedicated to providing supportive residential services for individuals with developmental disabilities. And I know there are individuals in this room that work on that side of the services.
That's great, because we are not good at all. And we've just not had that contact with development, disabled,
Okay.
that sort of thing. And we actually, when we did our last company-wide evaluation,
Yeah.
that's where we didn't have any, those with, disabilities, developmental disabilities, all those things. We have nothing for that.
Okay, so I was going to ask what kind of intersections there were between Stonewall's work and that work, and I
Yeah.
guess the answer might be none.
Yeah.
Where would you imagine that work could go, or what kind of work would you like to see in that area, the intersection between LGBT advocacy and developmental disability services?
Yeah, I think it would be exactly the same as the formerly incarcerated. Us not putting up barriers to members wanting to integrate into our community and social activities. So I needed to be informed about what the barriers were to formerly incarcerated coming to participate in our events, all of that things. Of course, things like simple things, transportation, not out to caseworkers, all kinds of things like that. It's the same thing for you to help us identify within Stonewall our own barriers to those members of our community and help us as a resource to bridge that gap. Like with formerly incarcerated, let's find the bridge from there to there. Again, all we can offer is engagement with our community, but that can be very powerful if an individual is particularly isolated. So that's on our agenda. That's been sort of looming. We felt very bad, but I have to reiterate, we have 6 full-time people. We run Pride and we have 15 programs. So, and we do these all the time. So I've sort of been, I've been careful now to make sure that we're not biting off more than we can chew. But again, that's why when we come out, most exciting thing to me is that you all become a resource to me too. That's the point of this. And really, I don't even begin to know the barriers that we are not inclusive at all because we're not aware of the barriers, let alone taking them down. So I would gladly invite that to us and maybe have you come do a cultural competency seriously with us about what that is and what that means, and we would love that. We'd love that. Yeah.
I want you to elaborate how the AIDS crisis encouraged a lot of the LGBT community to come out.
Yeah.
But I don't make the connection.
Yeah.
with that.
Well, what happened, and then I'll tell you, if you get a chance to watch a film called The Normal Heart, it's really how it was, and it addresses that issue. So I'll give you the perfect example. So I went to New York City in 1981, okay? Many of my friends ended up being gay. I was out, always in New York City. And at about 1984, 1985, men just started getting sick, okay? There were a million reasons we thought. The first one was poppers, inhaling poppers at clubs. We all thought they were poppers. We all thought, then it was drink glasses. The terror that was running through our community because we didn't even know why this was caused. And at that time, it started to be gay men, but lesbians didn't know they were immune at all. So it was this really frightful time. And when people started dying in numbers, and I mean numbers, I was going to 2 and 3 memorial services a week by 1990, 1991, and I'll tell you something else, people died very quickly then. If I didn't see someone in 3 months, I knew they were dead. If they were gay, and I didn't see them in 3 months, I knew they were dead, and there's not one exception to that in my life, not one. And so what happened was, the problem was that no one was paying attention. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that the Normal Heart talks about, Larry Kramer, who was a very loud activist and an ass, I can point to that, but he was our ass, okay? Very loud, but you know, he at the very beginning, there was a lot of conflict in the gay community, in the male gay community, because men wanted their sex. They just won their sexual freedom. Just won it. It wasn't that long after Stonewall. Just so to start closing the bathhouses down and all that sort of thing down seemed, you know, Victorian, draconian response to this. But what we soon found was that, of course, it was, you know, sexually transmitted. But Larry Kramer was invited to the White House by the Reagan administration to talk about this epidemic. He was in there for 4 minutes. When he answered, "Does this affect straight people?" No. He was ushered out the door and never talked to again. So what became very obvious was, you know, because people weren't out, there were so many gay people that worked in Mayor Koch's office, in the health department, but nobody was out. So nobody could do anything. As this community was dying, here's the real, you want to talk about conspiracy theories? You wait until you're going for a funeral to everybody you know, and it's not even on the cover of the New York Times, let alone any other paper. There was 7 years that I existed that nobody paid any attention. And so that's what it was. We realized we were invisible. And when invisible people die, nobody cares. Nobody cares. It was our invisibility that was allowing us to be killed. That's why the idea of coming out. So once someone came out in the mayor's office, or someone came out, when people in power, as members of the community, could start to question what was happening. But you know the truth. You know why everything changed? I'll tell you what. It finally affected a little white boy, Ryan White. It didn't change it because anybody cared about the gay men dying. It changed because Ryan White, a 10-year-old kid, got AIDS from a blood transfusion. Okay? That's what made AIDS a national issue and started to soften people's perspective. But here's the good thing. After that perception was softened, you got films like Philadelphia. Then the Matthew Shepard story got national coverage. It softened things enough, softened the view on AIDS enough that they weren't just drug-addicted, sex-fiend homosexuals. After it started to take some of that away from it, it allowed a gap for works of art, media coverage to start shifting. But again, I keep saying, once we came out, once you knew someone's son had died of AIDS, once you knew your uncle died of AIDS, once you knew that, again, we have a great saying at Stonewall, it's very difficult to hate someone whose story you know. So as long as they're the other, we can hate all we want. It's hard when that starts to come in your own family or your own friends or your own coworkers. So coming out has always been our power. Sometimes it's been our own power, but that ability to do, because if you're invisible, you will disappear from the face of this earth and nobody will ever know, and that goes for every minority on the face of the earth. And so we were out, so we just kept talking about it, and then pretty soon Ellen, you know, which and people laugh at me about this, but I give Ellen enormous credit. Ellen was coming to people's houses every day, and she talked about her marriage with pride. She didn't shy off talking, and she's funny, and she's appealing, and she's acceptable, and that transformation of having her in homes every single day, in middle-class homes and all sorts of populations, again, softening the view, just to start to let in the gap that says, okay, you know what, maybe, okay, well, Ellen's okay. Well, if Ellen's gay, well, okay, maybe I'll rethink this a little bit. Those kind of cultural icons cause people to rethink. Not necessarily agree, but rethink their previous positions that were based on stigma and prejudice and all those things. So that's the short story. We could, but it is. Here's what I do believe, and it's a terrible thing to say. I do not believe we'd have ever gotten marriage equality had the AIDS epidemic not happened. Truthfully, not to in any way validate it, but I do believe that because it made that divided community we were come together and learn how to be very powerful advocates and advocates for ourselves. We're so used to hiding the shadows. So not only we were out, but we were learning how to be advocates for our whole community, and that's what really made the difference, I think. Yeah.
And making the difference with our young people nowadays.
What's that?
You're making a lot of difference with the young people today because they are feeling it. How can I say it? It's like our young people under so much pressure with it that it comes into the family and it can cause a problem. But yet now that, like you said, Ellen came into the houses, into the homes to make it easy, and then with everything that's going on nowadays,
That's right.
It making it easy for our young people and the family members to even go and say, well, this is your decision.
That's right.
But I still love you.
That's right. The unconditional love
The
part of that.
unconditional, so
Yeah.
that can't change. You can still do what you need to do.
That's right.
Still become the person that you want to become
That's right.
and keep it going. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and still be a part of
And
this
still
family,
part
and
of
still
the-
have unconditional love for this
in that
family.
community.
And that's really all it
That's
takes.
all what it is.
Yeah, because you
Yeah.
know what's funny, when I finally came out to my parents when I was 16, accidentally, I was forced out of the closet. That would have been 1978, okay? While my parents were, my parents were pretty understanding, sent me to a psychiatrist. What else would parents do at that time?
Yeah.
But, here's how they perceived it. They never knew anyone that was gay. They didn't see anyone on TV. When they found out I was gay, they also thought that meant I was a drug addict, a pervert, a sex fiend, a pedophile. It used to be that word. So, of course, parents overreacted because they didn't know. They just, had all those perceived derogatory notions. So when you tell the parent you're gay, well, it wasn't just about loving another woman, or it was all this baggage that came with that word that scared them to death. Who would want that? Who would want drug addiction, perversion, living in the gutter, all those things for their kids? So that's to get rid of some of that baggage so that parents can react and family can react and chosen family can react in ways that are more appropriate and not take 50 years of history, with them to make decisions. Very scary when you think your child is going to perpetually be an other and not be allowed the access to society. And that's in those times, that's what they were looking at.
I think they
really
put
were.
too much on the kids that way. Parents do.
It is.
Because it's something they expected.
That's right.
They expected grandkids, or they
That's right.
expected a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law.
That's right.
You understand?
Expectations.
Expectations
Yeah.
of my children, and it's
Right. And now because of marriage equality, which is
Yeah.
kind of ironic, we work with the Family Pride Network very closely. We have adoption seminars all the time, artificial insemination, ways to have families. So now I don't know a lesbian family under 30 now that hasn't had a baby in the last year. They're married.
Right.
So here's the great irony that this all started with the family values. If you remember, as a matter of fact, 2004, the state ban on same-sex marriage was on a family values platform. We have stuck family values back in their faces so much to say, okay, you know what, we do agree. But if family values is so important, let us marry, let us be protected families, because before a year ago, if you were the non-biological parent, no matter what kind of agreement you had, or you even had an agreement in court, that split up, I guarantee you had no legal access to that child. And I saw it happen again and again. Myself in particular, I raised 5 stepkids for 7 years, and one day could never see them for the rest of my life. So the marriage equality allowed us to have the legal protections to build families that we could protect. Because even if you were the non-bio mom and the mom died, probably her parents would get those kids, not you. And that's what we're faced. So people are really hesitant to have families when you couldn't protect them, So, yeah, ironically, marriage equality, we're like, family values, woohoo! Yeah.
Okay. When you hear someone or overhear a conversation of people using improper language and pronouns, do you usually correct them? And do you think that others should also correct those individuals when we hear?
I think in particular, if the person isn't in the room in particular, I think, again, if it's purposeful misgendering or even accidentally. So if I were in a room and they were talking about someone, okay, that wasn't in the room, and they were using the wrong pronouns, and I knew those pronouns were different, I would intervene and say, in a very kind way, say, hey, I'm not sure you know, but, you know, Chris goes by male pronouns, not female pronouns. It would be that simple. Because chances are, it's accidental. If they're sitting here talking about a tranny faggot, you know, that's a different response. But again, I would respond in any way, again, to intervene. But if the person was in the room, I would probably, again, you know, I don't want to condescend and whisper my arrogance I would let them correct it themselves first in a situation where they're in a room and someone's misgendering them. I'm not sure if they're out, I'm not sure of the situation. So in the room, I would let them, I mean, I think it's respect. I would let them, any more than I don't want a man sticking up for me if I got a guy in my face, because I can beat him better than that guy can, I guarantee you. It's that sort of condescending notion of, oh, I've got to rush in to save. If it's in the room, I would allow them first. And then if persistence, or you see this person being harassed, just like anything, calling somebody a derogatory, any kind of name. If obviously it looks like this person is being hurt or harmed or everything, to jump in, but I would initially give them the first crack at the correction, because that's the most powerful, is it comes from them. But again, if they aren't in the room and I know differently, I would not hesitate to correct. And if it's derogatory language, absolutely, there's no doubt about it. But, and I've done that. I mean, we do. I'll be talking to Liam or something, and I'll say, no, you know, they go by they, them, and theirs. You'll learn about that in the trans. But, you know, we're constantly correcting each other. Oh, no, they go by they, them, and theirs. Like, oh, okay, thanks. So yes, absolutely. Again, it's just helping to understand. But again, the situation where the person's in the room can be so complicated. Again, you don't want to out them, but you don't want them to be, you know, so, you know, you got to use your judgment about that. But I would say this, respond in any way you would to anybody being harassed because of who they are or what kind of level of diversity they are, or the other. Well, even if it's a white cisgender heterosexual male that someone's calling fat, you know what I mean? I mean, it's the same kind of thing. So definitely sticking up for individuals like that. Again, you know, if you condone it, your silence is condoning it. But especially when people aren't in the room. I think that's the most powerful interaction or intervention that you can really do, is say, hey, it's not okay to, you know, do this behind your back. Yeah.
Just two things. One, a little humorous. I equate that with, like, you know, people moving away from the traditional pink and blue and baby.
Yes.
And they introduce, you look at the baby in the carriage and you don't know what to say.
That's right. That's right.
Beautiful, handsome.
Right.
But the second part, actually, I wanted to get to was, we talked about inclusion, because this is where we came from. This is what this is about.
Sure.
When in the acronym they came up with queer, and looking back at the elders that were the pioneers of the whole movement, is there a sense maybe of not being included, or not being included when that was all?
I think that's a great point.
You know, when that whole decision was made.
Yep.
Because now, you know, even in the communities, you hear the younger generation saying, you know, when you talk about AIDS, if you don't have sex with the older people, you're free of it.
That's right.
You'll never get it.
That's
It's an
right.
old person. So I just wonder how the community now feels that, look, we paved the way.
Yep.
And now you haven't included us in that.
You have, that's another discussion right there. We have a very robust Trailblazers 50+ program, over 250 seniors. There is no doubt that they were left out of that, and there is no doubt we have more ageism in this community than the cisgender heterosexual world does. It's a travesty, and one of the reasons we have started the senior is because, you know, nobody wants to see anybody used to be over 30 in a bar. So, you know, gay men over 30 just went away and disappeared. And, you know, lesbians over 30 were spinsters and not to be seen and heard. The ageism in this country, our community is unforgivable. And you're exactly right, that use of that word. And I can guarantee you there weren't any seniors making that decision. That language change was brought about by youth on campuses across the community. That you won't even find anybody writing about that. But here's the thing, it's a condescension too. They felt like they were taking that word back for the seniors. Again, being that savior, like what I was just saying. As opposed to assuming what they wanted and being their savior, you should have talked to them about it and been truly inclusive. Exactly what you're saying before. That's the difference between, you know, acting with arrogance and not really knowing someone older and really being inclusive about having them in the it's why we started Trailblazers. Our community is horrible with ageism. Horrible, absolutely horrible. Yeah.
How do you personally handle the individuals that use religion to try to break you down or make you feel bad about yourself?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it is, and that's its own thing. You know, and we're headed, there's no doubt there's a First Amendment, 14th Amendment clash happening in law. Here's what I say, as I said just to you today, okay? I am not here to challenge your religious views. I'm really not. It's okay if the guy that lives next to me hates lesbians for whatever reason, okay? Religion, political, whatever. But the law doesn't allow him to come bust my windows every night and do it. So protection of law is so important to our community because you know what? Again, I think it's a case of the more people who know you and get to know you, that sort of softens. But there has been religious intolerance in this world for, 5,000 years. And it's going to continue, and it flares up and it flares down. But I'll tell you, here's the cool thing. When the first Pride happened, there were many protesters as there were, people walking. This year, it was like one little guy with a sign at the end of the parade. So you just keep doing what you do. You file lawsuits if you have to, if that, again, discrimination, that somehow religious freedom cannot be used to discriminate. It's important to stay in the courts. It's important to stay and do that. But in my life, here's what I do. I just keep going. I just keep going. If you don't want to know me, I am not going to force you into knowing me. But again, that's why the laws are so important because, if religious freedom is ultimately legalized as discrimination, then that's another story. And again, that's for the courts to figure out. It's going to be a doozy of a fight. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And we're going to have to live with whatever that decision is. But again, we prepared ourselves after marriage equality. We knew it's just like anything, there's going to be a backlash. And you just have to do your thing. Don't strike out at them. Don't make them the enemy. People that for religious beliefs that don't, want to live it, go. You're not my enemy, okay? You're not my enemy until you start to hurt my community, you start to discriminate my community, and then you're not my enemy. You're just a force, again, to be reckoned with so that we can live authentically and do that safely. Safely, that's a big one. That's a big one. Because unfortunately, sometimes religious intolerance also gets people fired up. You think you're on a mission from God, and that can be a dangerous thing sometimes, regardless of what you believe, Yeah.
Do you think that there will ever be a time in the near future, with our younger generation being so accepting, so inclusive, taking the words back and things,
right.
Do you think there'll ever be a time where there'll never be the fear of being outed, that the only differences between gays, lesbians, and heterosexuals would
right.
be they're blonde, redhead,
right, right.
that there'll be no care as to...
Yeah, and I have mixed feelings about that a little bit. It's like, do I think that'll happen? No, I not in my lifetime. I'm 54. Again, it's because it depends where you live very often. Because there are going to be pockets of resistance to this, as there are to the Civil War, for God's sake. I mean, there's going to be pockets always that we're going to be the other. But I think within the next 10 or 15 years, there will be so many places that you can live authentically. And yes, because I even hear people say now, It's like my parents said the other night, it was shocking to me. I said someone got married, and they said, to a man or a woman? You know, like, it was so natural to them that, my parents are 78 years old. And now, and 4 years ago, they weren't that hip on gay marriage. Now they're like, oh, was it a man or a woman? So in that amount of time, again, I think it's where you live. Again, I think it is how often you engage with that other is so that you don't fear them and do that. So again, us getting out socially and being parts of the larger community is important to transform that idea. But part of me that is kind of about that is, it's also this notion of we live in a colorblind world or a religious blind. We still want to be a community. We don't want to be erased completely into the heterosexual. I know it looks like that. I always call them our equality narratives. We tell these stories because we're just like you. And when we are, but we still have our own culture, we still have our own community, so we want to exist within the larger heterosexual community, but not be erased, if that makes sense. If that makes sense. Yeah.
I often have conversations with, I'm trying to think of how I'm going to say it without being specific, with people of color, and we're talking about the issues that people of color face, and then the LGBTQ community.
That's an intersection. That's yeah.
And a lot of times, people cannot see the, for lack of a better word, similarities in the struggle. So what do you say when people say that the LGBT community does not struggle the same way that people of color do? Because I disagree with that on a lot of different levels. But what do you say to when people have that type of, I mean, I know you don't want to,
No, but I'll tell you, first of all, and I said this from the very beginning, I think it was very wrong of the LGBT community to appear to be co-opting the civil rights movement as the same struggle and the same risk. They're different. They're different times. They were different risks in different parts of the country. You know, it was like, we just showed a film last year, it was called The New Black. Gay is the New Black. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. And I think that caused some sort of, the LGBT community is recently being inclusive of race. This was a very white, monolithic movement of gay white men that funded everything in this community, and because they funded it. They had the money because the rest, no one else could aspire to those kind of professions and those jobs. They funded the community centers. They funded, so they got the voice. And not only did they get the voice, they got to choose the voices. And it wasn't necessarily malicious. It was just how things worked out. So only is this community, I think, starting to even look at, in the last 10 years, starting to look at intersections of race and how the LGBTQ experience across, for people of color in particular, is a very different experience. And again, I think that's been a blindness in our community, is to really just assume that because a minority was used to struggling for their rights, that they would just, join this parade and this march now and that was a question, is it tougher to be a person of color, tougher to be LGBTQ? Well, that's a hard decision right there. I'd say the intersection of that is a very different place, and it needs to be included, and that perspective needs to be included, and this community is striving to do that now. And it's a difficult one, because I think we've had such a bad history of inclusion that to go back now and say, oh, hey, people of color, we're interested in what you have to say now. It's like, now you are, after all this time. So it's a very complicated issue. So that's pretty much it. Thank you. Let us be a resource to you. Again, just thanks for the pleasure of doing this. And I think you guys do great work over here. And let's continue a great partnership. Okay.
So we do have some future opportunities coming up. We have, again, it's been mentioned several times, in October, we are going to have a training on transitions in particular. We're going to talk a lot about pronouns, a lot about the stuff that we did today, but going a little bit deeper. We are, I believe, still hasn't been nailed down yet, but we do have a December training, which I'm hoping will focus on ageism. In the interim, we have a September and November training, both focused on implicit bias. Some of you will have had the, I hope, pleasure of coming to our previous implicit bias trainings. I think it's one of the most fun that we do. We go up in the computer, is no longer one of the most fun that we do. It's one of the second most fun that we do. We go up to the computer lab, we actually take the implicit association test that's been developed by Harvard, and we get into a very nice, rousing discussion about, what our lizard brain is doing and how it's affecting our behavior in ways that our conscious, deliberately anti-racist or anti-bigoted beliefs might not be doing, but our lizard brain is working against us in all sorts of ways. So that's training opportunities coming up, and then of course there will be more in 2017. But if you'll join me, folks, I'm just so glad to have had Lori here.
Oh, thank you. This was great. You guys were great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, and that concludes this. Thank you so much.